Well, good afternoon. No, good evening. Against the Stream Nashville. What is today? May 17th, 2015. How you doing? That's a good answer. Not sure what to say. Often when I speak to a group I'm not familiar with, I spend some time introducing myself and my practice, and that may be a useful way to start, although I'm sick of doing that, so I'll make it brief, because I've done this for years. I'm a Zen teacher. I feel like it's a AA meeting thing. My name is Brad, and I'm a Zen teacher. Hello, Brad. Often I feel like it's a slightly shameful thing, something I did when I was younger and sort of regret now. I got into Zen practice when I was late teens. I just started college at Kent State University up in Ohio and came across this Zen teacher who taught me how to do Zazen, and been doing it ever since. I kind of got into it as a personal practice, and later on I moved to Japan, and I met this guy named Budo Nishijima who became my teacher over there, and he really wanted me to ordain and become a teacher, and kind of almost coerced me into doing it. And he was a very old man by then, and he would say, he gave me the Buddhist precepts and gave me what they call Dharma transmission, and then I was kind of like, okay, that's nice. And then he started saying things like, well, I'm very old, and doing these classes in English every week is kind of a burden. Would you mind taking over the classes in English? And I don't want to take over okay. Would you mind taking over the retreats, too, that we do every year? I'm like, no, I don't want to take over the retreats. So anyway, I became a Zen teacher that way, and wrote a book about it called Hardcore Zen, and wrote several other books after that. Sit Down and Shut Up, Zen Wrapped in Karma, Dipped in Chocolate, Sex, Sin, and Zen, and There Is No God and He Is Always With You. Those are did I get 5? Those are the 5 of them. And the next one that's supposed to come out later this year is called Don't Be a Jerk. So that's the sort of thing that I do. I have prepared all these notes, but I don't know if I'm going to use them or not, because I've started lately becoming concerned with the teachings of nonviolence. Has become interesting to me and concerning to me, especially in light of some recent events in the United States that we're all quite familiar with. Various riots in Ferguson and Baltimore, and who knows where it's going to happen next. And of course this is going on all over the world, and I've been involved with Buddhist practice for quite a long time. People are always, I'll let you guess my age, but no one ever guesses my age because I'm older than I look. So I've been involved in Buddhist practice for longer than most people who look at my face would expect I could have possibly been. They go, what did you start when you're an infant? No. So I've been involved with this for a while now, and I got into it as a kind of outgrowth of my involvement in the punk rock scene in Akron and Cleveland, Ohio, which was at the time very strongly influenced by the DC punk scene. I don't know. I won't assume I'll assume a lot of you are familiar with that, but not everybody. the DC punk scene was very famous for being quite interested in ethics of all things. You know, when I found that when I often go to the UK these days, and if I talk about my punk rock background and the idea of getting into this kind of ethical practice based on punk rock, the British people think that's hilarious because punk rock over there was mostly known for drunken rowdiness, and as it is often over here. Aside from a few bands like the Clash and the Sex Pistols, there's a handful of others that the sort of political punk thing didn't take off there as much as it did here. But so the scene in Akron was heavily involved in political action of a sort. It was very disorganized political action, but we were against Reagan and we were against all this other stuff and the nuclear armaments build up and all of this. I have a photo of me playing a gig with Zero Defects, a band I was in, and there's a prominent nuclear freeze button on my shirt there, and I was like, oh, the nuclear freeze, I remember that. So there was all of that. So I was already kind of committed to this idea of nonviolence as an ideal and wanting general sort of peace on earth and goodwill to all and all of that nice stuff. And lately I've started to think a little differently about this idea of nonviolence, because I think it's an important thing. And I think as human beings, we would like to see human society continue into the future. I hope most of us in the room are in agreement with that. And we'd like to have a certain level of security and peace. We don't want to be fighting each other all the time. And so when things like these riots in Ferguson and the injustices and all of that happen, it's pretty alarming. We have an interesting position being Americans. I've spent a significant portion of my own life outside of the United States, which kind of warped my perspective on America in a way. When I was a child, my family lived for almost 4 years in Nairobi, Kenya, which is where Obama is from. But it's where Obama's dad is from, though. And it's not a Muslim country. It is largely a Christian country and has been for a long time. So even if he was from Kenya, the likelihood of him being a Muslim actually goes down if he was actually from Kenya, rather than being more likely. So spent that time there as a kid and kind of grew up in this very different environment where being a white person meant you were a minority member. Not necessarily a downtrodden minority member, but a kind of suspicious minority member, because their experience with non-African people, white people, was British people who were colonizers and tended to be very arrogant. And so I found, even as a kid, I was 11 years old when we came back, but even as a kid, I found it was useful to work into a conversation with a new person that I met that I was American and not British, because they would give you more slack if they found out you were American and not British, because they didn't at that time have any really strong opinions about Americans. That's probably changed by now, but at the time Americans were kind of a new thing on the scene there. And then in the 90s I moved to Japan and ended up spending 11 years in Japan. As Americans, we have this nice isolation from the hot spots of the world. We're way over on the other side of the globe. So even though we were involved in both world wars, really, other than Pearl Harbor, there wasn't any significant damage done to our country. And we've always kind of been removed from that. And yet, and that allowed us to become a superpower, and now pretty much the only superpower militaristically in the world. And we have this kind of unique position, which is quite interesting in terms of what do we do about violence and nonviolence, and what's our Buddhist duty towards that. I think human beings are, having done this Zen practice for a long time, my view of what a human being is has changed in ways that I find more and more difficult to explain to people who haven't done a lot of this practice, because we kind of grow up with a certain specific understanding of what a human being is, and we imagine that we are individuals. We're individual units who are kind of free to roam around this rather inert playing board of the world. That we go here and there and wherever we want, and we are individual units, and we have freedom of choice and all of this other stuff. Doing more and more Zen practice and meditation practice, one of the things that started to happen for me was to see this dividing line I had thought was there between me and other people, and ultimately the rest of the world, and ultimately the universe, start to dissolve in a very real way, not in a kind of comic book acid trippy way, but actually starting to see that, oh my God, all this stuff that I've read about in Buddhist texts about there being a kind of unity between all people and all things, it wasn't just a metaphor. It wasn't just kind of an idea. It wasn't just sort of a nice story that people were telling. It was actually a more accurate description of what was going on in my immediate life and in the lives of all of us than the story I'd grown up with that said we were individual autonomous units marching around on the stage of the world with free will and so forth. Such that when I approach the problem of nonviolence, I find that my understanding of it has changed radically. The first thing is I feel a kind of responsibility for things that in common sense terms are not my responsibility at all. I remember the most sort of spectacular, not spectacular, but the most kind of to be shocking point of this, at least up until that time, was I was in Japan when the attacks on September 11th happened, and I watched it on television, and if you were in Japan, this all happened in the late evening. I think the news reports started to show up on TV around 9 at night, and I only happened to see them because I had a housemate who was watching some sort of a drama show, and I wasn't even paying much attention. I happened to be in the room. I think I was eating something, and she was watching this thing, and all of a sudden they cut away from this drama show to show the smoking. Both of the towers were on fire by the time they showed this thing on TV. So I'm just going, what the fuck is going on there? But I started to feel like this is my responsibility, which is weird, not my personal responsibility as Brad Warner, man in Japan, but in a sense, I was sharing the responsibility for this, and I couldn't say, well, look what those people did anymore, because I'd gone through this process to the degree where it no longer appeared to be the action of those people. It seemed to be the action of us, of a bigger us to which I was intimately connected, and that was disconcerting. I think more disconcerting probably than it would have been if I could have said, look what those terrorists did, look what those bad people did to us nice people, or conversely, look what we people fighting for whatever the hell they were fighting for did to those bad Americans, It was no longer that. It was me killing me because we were all confused about what we were supposed to be doing. And so I've started to come to a different sort of approach to this, and I kind of made the mistake of getting a little bit involved in a bit of an internet thing about nonviolence recently, which you shouldn't get into, because I found that the people who support nonviolence can be pretty aggressive and mean. And this wasn't really surprising to me, but it's still sort of surprising when it happens, Because I saw something that a group called the Buddhist Peace Fellowship did recently, on behalf of all Buddhists, and I thought that what they were doing seemed kind of still involved in making it an us versus them proposition, so that but it was no longer us Americans versus those bad Muslims or whatever it is, whatever the latest version of it is. Because it shifts the kind of terminology we use to describe this phenomenon will shift historically. So right now and right now for us Americans, it's us nice Americans versus those evil Muslims who want to control us, or maybe it's us versus the Obama trying to take over Texas, or whatever version of it. It happens to be, changes, but the same phenomenon keeps appearing over and over, in different forms. And if you make it about us good Buddhists who are against the military, I feel like we're just playing in this. We're just playing the same game again. Which doesn't mean I don't think we should be critical of the things that are done on our behalf as Americans, because I feel like I've been critical of things that were done on our behalf as Americans for long enough, long enough that I have solid ground to stand on in that area. But I also feel like we are in a very complicated situation where we at once benefit from militarism, and so when we start denouncing it, I think it's very important to also acknowledge how it benefits us, and to look at what we can do about it. And I don't feel like the solution is to simply fall back into another version of us versus them. And when I wrote this, there was a lot of people who were getting pissed off at me and something. But somebody, and I wish I could credit the person, mentioned this thing about the ocean, which I thought was really interesting. And what he said, which I can't remember word for word, was something like we'll look at the ocean sometimes, and sometimes we say it's peaceful and calm, and sometimes we say it's violent and angry. And we use those as metaphors, but we understand that the ocean isn't actually angry. But that's our take on it and our description of it. And I thought that was really good, because I started thinking, well, where can you take that metaphor? Because I think you can take it. Metaphors always fall apart at a certain point, but I think you can take that one even a few steps further. We like the ocean when it's peaceful and calm, because that's useful to us as human beings. When it's angry and violent, we don't like it. But we understand, because it's the ocean and it's not human society, that the anger that we see happening sometimes with the ocean or with the sky this afternoon, right, is a natural process, and that if we try to somehow force that process to stop, we're actually creating a bigger problem. I started to wonder how human violence works, and I'm not. This isn't one of those speeches where I'm trying to lead to a conclusion. I'm leading only to a question, which is a question that I've started to ponder a lot, which is, how different are we? I tend to think human beings are part of the natural process of the world, and some of our violence is part of what we are. Now, I don't want to take that and say, this is often used as kind of an excuse for bad behavior. You say, well, it's just human nature. And I think even if you are to say it's just human nature, the question then is, well, what are we going to do about it? Because we've reached a kind of critical point in our evolution at this level. There was a time when these processes of getting angry at each other and having a blow-up and having a war, they happened, and it was sad and violent and messy, but we recovered from it. And for thousands of years we were able to do that. We just go back and forth, and the Romans slaughter the whatever. I don't know. I was a history major, but I can't just pull these things out. But there's a war over here in England, and there's a civil war in the United States, and there's all these other things that happen, and we recover from it. But we've reached this kind of critical point because of technology and because of our big brains that figure out things, where we can't sustain that anymore. I think World War II was probably the final time that human beings could actually recover from a major war. We had that war and we managed to recover from it. But immediately after, we started developing just amazing technology to the point where, as everybody knows, we can, I don't know what the statistic is. We can kill everything on the planet 50 times over or something like that. I don't know what, it keeps changing, but it's very dangerous. So we have this very dangerous situation where examining the phenomenon of violence and nonviolence becomes a critical issue. But it's something that it appears to me we have to do something about it, but doing something about it means a kind of very radical change, which I don't know if I hope that we are capable of it. I think we're intrinsically capable of it. I hope that we can find a way to do it. And I would like to think that this thing called Buddhism that I've been involved with for 30-some years, it can be a part of that. That we're not just here gazing at our own navels and wasting time, that we can actually do something for the world at large. and maybe even save it. That sounds so ambitious. But I'd like to hope that we can. And so recently, this little internet kerfuffle I got into was because I was so disappointed that that people, in the name of Buddhism, seem to be going again in the direction of us versus them. So it's we peaceful Buddhists against the militarists, you know. Which, I'll say it again, I don't think it's wrong to critique the military or anything, but we have to understand where we're coming from and what sort of change is necessary. Because the change that's necessary is a deep change in what we are and what we have been and what we've evolved to be. And it's become a matter of survival for us as a species. We could wipe ourselves out if we don't get a handle on this. And more than, I don't know, ISIS or all these other little things than that, I think the real danger is that we get so far into this that we can't turn back and we end up wiping ourselves out. And I don't want that to happen. That would be inconvenient. I got a bunch of guitars at home. I don't want to lose all my guitars and things. And when we say that we want peace and stability, is it that we just want comfort for ourselves? Or is it something more than that? I'd like to think it's something more than that. I mean, the first level of wanting peace is we just want to be able to come home to the same apartment every day and not find it ransacked by the Cossacks or whatever, But another level is can we sustain a world where everyone lives in peace, which is, I think, a pertinent question, especially in terms of overpopulation and stuff. These are like questions I think a lot of us don't want to face, and I don't want to face them really. But you have to kind of, if you look at history, you have to think, well, war has been useful. It's not a good thing, but it's been useful because it keeps the population down. It does all kinds of useful things, and that might be why we're sort of programmed possibly to engage in it. And mass slaughter would solve a lot of the world's problems. This is I say that, I don't say that because I'm advocating it, but I think it's true, But we don't. I think we want to find a different way. We don't want another mass slaughter to cut down the problems of pollution and global warming and overcrowding and all the rest of it. We want to find a way where we can all live and live out our natural lives in a kind of stability, and not wipe each other out. So what's going to do that? And I don't have an answer, but it's sort of like the old Police song, there is no political solution, I think maybe they were right. I'm not a big fan of the Police, but I find them kind of insufferable in a lot of ways as people. But then again, speaking of police, that's this is one of the levels. I know this is a bit rambling, but it's something that occurred to me while we were sitting because a siren went by. I'm sure a lot of us noticed that as we were sitting and trying to meditate. It was whatever, it went by here. And it's a common sound that we hear all the time. And I was doing this new book that I wrote, but which won't be published for a few months now, is about Dogen, who was the founder of the sect of Zen that I study in. And he lived in Japan in the 1200s CE. And I was reading a book about Dogen as part of the research, and the author of this book happened to just kind of drop one thing in that he spent about 2 or 3 sentences discussing, which just was like, whoa, it's one of those things where an author gets on a point and you're going, wait a minute, what about that? That was my reaction, because he mentioned there were no police at the time, in Dogen's time in Japan. Right? There were no police at all, which meant that if a crime happened, or you were robbed or raped, or somebody you knew was murdered, or something along that level, there was no sort of authority to turn to. The government was way off in the other side of the country, and they weren't really dealing with those sort of small level problems. About the best you could hope for was to find some samurai who you could convince to take vengeance for you. And we've developed beyond that. But as we've seen in Baltimore and Ferguson and Los Angeles and so many other places in this country, that power gets abused, and terrible things happen, and wrong things happen. But I think most of us would think the solution to that is don't get rid of the police, reform them. But I run into people, in fact, a few people. Well, there's a guy who sits with us regularly whose feeling is that we need to get rid of the police, and I'm like, I live in Los Angeles. I live in Silver Lake. The gangs tag the front of my apartment building on a fairly regular basis. I don't really want to give up on the Los Angeles police force just yet. I'm kind of glad they're there for all their flaws, and I stay away from them because I know they're basically assholes. But I'd like to think that there's some sort of regulations, apparently, allegedly there are, for them. And what do we do about the military? We don't want to get rid of the military. I don't think most of us do. But how can we make it work so terrible things don't happen, because things get very complicated. So, as I say, this is one of those speeches where I'm leading to a bunch of questions and not any solutions. I'm not going to propose any. I don't have any, except that I think meditation is ultimately part of it. Because for me, it has exposed me to myself, to the point where I start to see violence as no longer something outside of myself that's done by other people. I start to see violence as whatever's going on in the human race is also going on in me personally, and I feel responsible for it at some level, as I said in the beginning. So I think I'll stop there and see if anyone has any comments or has any discussion points about all this, because I think it's a problem or a matter that demands a kind of attention, and I'd like to see it get the proper attention, and not get left off. Yeah.
Just for backstory, what kind of backlash were you getting on the internet? Like, what was the most common kind of reactionary anger you're getting from this?
Yeah, well, I got a lot of people being very supportive. I got people saying that I was, I think, an empty-headed pro-military person was one of them. Somebody found it on Facebook and read it to me this morning when we just arrived here for the beginning of the retreat. Dim-witted? Dim-witted pro-military. Thank you. And a dupe of the MSM, which I did not know stood for mainstream media. This sort of thing. And then there was the Buddhist Peace Fellowship put up this article, which I found interesting because the writer made some good points, but seemed also rather aggressive, but in a way that she seemed to have learned how to form her aggression into a way that didn't seem aggressive, which I found quite interesting. I read the article and I said, I think she's saying I'm stupid, you know. And if you follow me on Facebook, you can go and look at it and see if you think I'm right. I think she's calling me stupid, but in this kind of very complicated, educated way, you know, which is basically, well, what's your solution? And I wanted to say, well, we benefit from the military and things, so we have to kind of watch what our stance is. My main teacher is a guy named Gudo Nishijima. He died, I don't know if it was 2015 or into 2014, but fairly recently. He was very old, 92, or I think was his age. So he was old enough that he had been a soldier, a Japanese soldier in the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II, and saw. He was stationed in Manchuria, which no, sorry, not Manchuria. The other one, not Manchuria. That's where the bad stuff happened. Where was the one? Shit. Now I'm blanking on it. Maybe it was Manchuria. No, it was Manchuria.
The Rape of Nanking?
No, the Rape of Nanking was not Manchuria.
Right.
Nanking is south, and Manchuria is in the north.
Okay.
So basically, nothing much went on in Manchuria during the war. You know, the Japanese occupied it, and the Chinese didn't like having them there, but there wasn't much fighting going on. They were just sort of outposts carrying their guns and looking scary, and nothing much happened. But he was returned to Japan to find the country leveled. You know, so his take on matters of peace and war was quite different, and a lot of people thought of him as being pro-military, but when he would point out things like war is very effective, you know, which is different from saying I support war, you know, and my problem with a lot of what I see in the kind of pro-peace stuff is an unwillingness to acknowledge just how effective it is. You know, the thing I was reacting to was a banner these people had unfurled that said, let's see if I can get this right, U.S. militarism breeds violence, not safety. I work for peace and something, I forget. Big banner they had. And I thought, well, I agree that U.S. militarism does breed violence, but to say it doesn't breed safety at all, well, you know, we got to look at that. You know, I'm not saying it's the best solution or it's the right way, but if you say it doesn't do anything to increase our safety, I'd have to say no. I think it does. I'm sad about that. I want to change that. I want us to find a different way, a better way, an effective way that doesn't breed this horrible backlash against it. But I think we can't get there until we acknowledge that, hey, you know, it does kind of make us safer. You know, I don't want it to make us safer, but, you know, I'm not going to say it doesn't. And I find as an individual, this revelation or this understanding is actually terrifying to me as an individual person. I would be much more comfortable. The title of the first article that I wrote about it was called "I Wish I Could Agree," and that wasn't, I didn't mean that rhetorically. I think maybe a lot of people misunderstood who read it, that I thought that was like a rhetorical thing, like, I wish I could agree, ha ha ha. It was, I really wish, tap my heels together 3 times, that I could agree with that. Because it would make things so much simpler if that were the case. But I don't think it's the case. I think the problem is more complicated than that. And to me, the problem of human violence, trying to solve the problem of human violence, is a lot like trying to solve the problem of oceanic violence. You know, it's not so simple and clear what can be done and what we can do as individuals to make it happen and to help it happen. It may be buried deep within all of us, and if we're going to work on it, we may have to do a kind of work that most of us aren't prepared to do. You know, a kind of really deep honesty that says, okay, I'm responsible for this, and as a person who's responsible for it, and I don't just mean in terms of how you vote and things like that. I mean, that's a very superficial kind of responsibility. I think we're intrinsically responsible for it, as just by being alive, you know, which makes it intensely complicated. But I do think there's a way to turn it around, and I think we're capable of finding it. Because I'm also optimistic. And one of the things I hated about Nishijima Roshi, my teacher in Japan, for a long time when I studied with him, was that he was so fucking optimistic. He really believed in humanity's ability to make itself better. And he thought we were going in a very good direction, which I came to Japan for a number of reasons. A lot of it was economic and stuff, but also it was because of being deeply disgusted with the United States. You know, I'm like, fuck this country, it's a big mess, you know, and I'm just going to get out of here. And I went to Japan, and I ended up studying with a Japanese Zen teacher who thought America was pretty great. You know, if you get him talking about World War II, it's quite interesting. He'll say, I remember somebody getting him talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, and he was going, the Americans were right to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you know, and you're going, whoa, what are you talking about? You know, you say, the Japanese were completely wrong, even though he fought for the Japanese cause at the time. He says that Japan was completely wrong. And I just found that interesting, and I had to kind of revise my opinion about America and what it does.
You mentioned Baltimore and Ferguson, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And there's been certainly a lot of press on that. One of the things that's kind of changed I've been struggling with is that, I mean, I grew up in the South, and so
Right.
it was, you know, surrounded by blatant racism.
Yeah.
And I've always taken as more of a personal stance as like treat people equitably.
Yeah.
But now there's a strong discussion going on in the public sphere about, well, that's fine, but then we bear the brunt of this bubbling, like the ocean metaphor, that there's this thing bubbling all around, and we're as white people we're responsible for it. And then it's like that's really turned my head. It's like, okay, well, I have to sit with that and see how we approach that, because that's, I mean, honestly, that never really. I was like, I'll treat people equitably. I'll be good in this respect.
Yeah.
And historically, sure, we bear responsibility for that. But what can I do about that? And I think that ties into some of the stuff.
It's a really interesting question. You know, Minor Threat, who was a big influential band, had that song "Guilty of Being White." I don't know if anybody remembers that. But Ian MacKaye wrote it because he grew up in D.C., where in his high school being white was a minority, you know, and there was a lot of pressure on him by the people around him to feel this kind of white guilt. And, you know, he's saying, I think the lyrics is guilty of a racist crime 100 years before my time, or something like that. I don't know if I'm getting the lyric right. But in a way, there is that that sort of how are we responsible, and are we responsible by virtue of being born a certain race?
Because that's been the implication of the writing for that statement.
And in a way, we aren't personally responsible for it, but I think the human race is responsible for that, because racism takes so many forms. If you think about Nazi Germany, it looks like white people against white people from our perspective, from the sort of perspective we've grown up with in America. It's hard to understand. Well, that's racism. Well, wait a minute. These are white people, and these are other white people. I lived in Africa, and they called it tribalism over there, but there is no. They thought it was hilarious. I remember this coming up because I think maybe it was Richard Pryor who came over during the time and was talking about black unity, and they thought that was a big joke, because they didn't see themselves as the black people. They saw themselves as Kikuyu, and those are the Luo over there, and we don't like the Luo. That was the big turmoil in Kenya at the time, and still is. The two major tribes just fucking hate each other, and they're always vying for political power and trying to put the other one down and stuff. So I think it's interesting how we benefit. White people. When I say we white people benefit incredibly from racism. And it's a sad thing.
Brett, I may have totally misunderstood, but what I sense is you started out talking about being concerned about us humans.
Yeah.
But what makes us exempt from what's impermanence? I mean, there's the human race.
The human race may be impermanent, yeah.
Well, it's at least a possibility, right?
It is. I kind of feel like we're a unique sort of creature, and this is just my personal opinion, and maybe a bit speculative, but I'll just put it out there. We may outlast even the cockroaches because we're so adaptable, and I kind of think, I kind of spoke in hyperbole about us wiping ourselves out with nuclear weapons and things. But I think what would actually happen if there was a nuclear war is we'd wipe out most of the humans. But there'd probably be enough of us left over to form a breeding population, and it might take 1,000 years or more than 1,000 years, but we'd end up back. We'd end up back in the same place.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I've heard you say loud and clear, obviously I have not had exactly that experience, where you suddenly felt like you could no longer understand yourself so much as an individual that moves around like that. But I mean, that may just be it. I mean, because with that, I guess you became concerned.
Yeah.
With that, a certain amount of ignorance or ignorance, if you will, as Al Watts would put it, just fell away. You said you could no longer find excuses because you felt responsible yourself.
Yeah.
That's what I heard you say.
Yeah.
Well, so then, that maybe is a task for Buddhists to make other people, or to really promote the type of meditation that might get you there. Because once we become concerned, once we have that feeling ourselves, then we cannot be ignorant anymore. And I think a lot of the problems that we're talking about tonight are out of ignorance.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think that's exactly right. I think it's hard though to come to that understanding, to that kind of level of understanding, because for myself, I remember hearing that for years, because I was, who knows why does an 18-year-old kid get committed to meditation? I say that because I came to Knoxville to witness my niece's graduation. She just turned 18. It's impossible for me to imagine her meditating. She's just bouncing off the walls. But so I got very interested in this, and I felt like I had to work really hard. So it's not something that somebody can just tell you. So that's why I like to promote meditation as a thing to do, this kind of deep introspection and looking into ourselves until the barriers fall away and we start to see a new way of looking at things. And that new way of looking at things, I think, will eventually occur. And we'll have a different sort of society then. It'll be interesting. I don't know. I don't expect to live to see it. But I think we would be capable of almost anything if a large enough... This sounds very utopian and like one of those... I'm starting to sound like Deepak Chopra a little bit, I think, if I get into this. But I think we have almost unlimited capacity to do incredible things if we can just get our shit together, you know. We just have to stop battling each other all the time. And so on the short term, we need things like cops and soldiers and police, you know, whatever. I said cops twice, right? But anyway, you know, you need that kind of thing in order to make it happen. There's this great article that I constantly reference by Stephen Batchelor called Spaces in the Sky that he wrote for, I think, the November 2001 issue of Tricycle. So he wrote it, he must have written it within weeks of the attacks on September 11th, 2001, in which he points out that in order for Buddhism to exist, it has to be protected, you know, militarily. And I've been thinking about that ever since, because I read that article, you know, right after it came out when it was new, and it's been something I've gone back to and read again and again, because I think he's on to something in that article, and what he's on to is kind of disturbing to me. You know, I want us to get there. I want us to I want Buddhist practice to be able to flourish and for more people to be able to do that. But for example, a lot of Buddhist practice takes place in monasteries, as you know, we're all kind of aware. Monasteries depend for their existence and survival on the non-monastic population. So the only way the monastery can exist is if people who are not in the monastery support them, or else they just can't. They can't buy their food. They can't keep the electricity on. You know, whatever. They can't survive, and they fall apart, and there's no more monastery. And that's a kind of microcosm of all of us. All of us who want to meditate and work on these problems depend on a population who aren't involved in that. And this, you know, and this makes it a very tricky problem. And I find one of the things I keep doing is I found, and I'm really pleased with this, I found that a lot of the audience who comes to see me are often like Marines or ex-Marines or Navy people and stuff, because they often feel rejected by other Buddhist teachers, you know, or feel kind of ashamed of the livelihood that they've chosen. But I want to see more Buddhists in the Marines, and more Buddhists in the Navy, and more Buddhist cops, you know, but who can still do their job, you know. So yes, I would like to see meditation and things promoted, but I also feel like it's necessary to be realistic about if we said everybody should drop everything and start meditating, we're kind of fucked, you know, because they're not going to, and we'd end up with a kind of chaos. Yeah.
You had made the statement that American militarism makes us feel safe. Geopolitically, I'm something of an isolationist.
Mm-hmm.
And while I think it makes us safer to the extent it exists in this continent,
Yeah.
I would disagree that it makes us safer in places like Afghanistan.
Sure, yeah.
And Kuwait and Iraq, and to the contrary, I think it actually promotes an anti-Americanism.
It sure does, yeah.
Ultimately makes us less safe.
Yeah, it sure does. But what do we do about that? Because there's two things going on. So it keeps the country as a whole safer, and then makes us look like a bunch of assholes who should be attacked, you know. And we do horrible things, you know, bombing weddings and all this horrible shit we're doing in other parts of the world. But we can't. We're too. I don't know. I'm not a good politician, but I feel like when I observe it, I think we're so deeply into it that we can't simply stop. So, what can we do? And I often feel like we are improving, but we're improving very slowly. You know. I don't have a solution, but I feel that's true, and I could feel that traveling abroad. You know, as an American, it's kind of. I mean, I do most of my traveling in Europe, but I did go to Israel. You know, and you feel that what you're talking about in Israel, because the Palestinians, you know, who are especially in Jerusalem, are a huge portion of the population. They don't, you know, they don't like America and what it's doing and what it's done. But God, I don't know. I don't know what the solution is.
I grew up in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And I lived there for half of my life and lived the other half here.
Mm-hmm.
And I find myself in a very odd position. Like when Bush was president. A lot of got it from my European friends. What an arrogant asshole.
Yeah.
What a little cowboy. Who does he think he is? Or whatever.
Yeah.
And I found myself explaining how something like that was possible. But I also was able to uniquely then qualify to let those guys know, look, you got your own arrogance. You got your old world arrogance. Because when you sit with Europeans and you hear them, they have their own type of arrogance. Like we're, you know, you guys, you don't know what you're talking about. Because you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
You have it everywhere. It's just a slightly different form, a slightly different depth. But for me, I really think it is individual. It's an individual thing. And then one individual becomes concerned, and then maybe more individuals become concerned, and then you have a movement. And I really think that is what turned the tide in the civil rights.
Yeah. People got involved, and
it's slow.
Yeah, it's always slow, and it's always incremental. And what do you know what? I think the unique situation now is we have, because of technology, it's become an urgent problem that we can't put off anymore. And that's, you know, how does it work? You know, racism. When somebody brings up racism, I found it interesting. I shouldn't. I got a weird reaction when I brought it up earlier. But I've been researching Adolf Hitler recently because I had this idea for a book that I could write that would involve Hitler, and it's a long story. But what was interesting to me is to find out, not towards the end of his life, obviously, but when he was a young person, Hitler had Jewish friends, you know. And it's an interesting thing to see how racism works, because it made me remember my friend Matt, this guy I knew in college, who was the most racist person I ever met, and he had black friends, but he always thought, well, those guys are okay, they're the exceptions, you know. And it's interesting how we can kind of manipulate our minds to work that way. So this kind of it becomes a very tricky problem because we're very clever. We can cleverly manipulate any situation into what we can explain ourselves to ourselves in ways that make us the hero, and yeah, and when we have to watch how that works, because we want it to be black and white, but it never is.
It's my understanding that some 75, 100,000 years ago, it's like when humans developed the mirror neurons. Right?
Mirror neurons, yeah.
Yeah, mirror neurons.
Right.
So being able to experience something as it happens to somebody else and getting that experience. It wasn't there before. So mankind took a major leap because now we were cooperating and we were empathizing with other people.
Yeah.
But it also made us very dangerous. Because like your group suddenly separated
Oh, right.
from other groups.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't have no answer there either. But it seems like we're going like this a little bit now.
Well, I think eventually we'll have a kind of human race, a kind of consciousness that we are the humans, rather than we are the, whatever we say we are. But I don't know what it'll take to get us there. God, I'm kind of out of time, and I don't want to get on the most, on a really controversial topic, but one of the things that somebody was saying is one of the criticisms when I put this thing on the internet was like, you're just in favor of empire building. And I started thinking, well, I'm not really in favor of empire building, but if I think about it, there are some benefits to empire building. I don't want to say Coca-Cola should take over the world or anything, but, a common language, a common culture, a common frame of reference that helps us all understand each other. These are beneficial things. I'm at once sort of disgusted that everywhere in the world they watch Hollywood movies, but also sort of thinking, well, that's interesting because it produces a kind of common frame of reference that we can all understand each other a little better. Even though they're shitty movies or whatever. But at least we can all kind of understand we're all developing this common consciousness, and that needs to happen. I don't think it's proper that America dominates that, but I think that's just the current status. I think as the global culture increases, America will get a smaller and smaller share of it. Unfortunately, this is what I assume will happen, and that it'll become more truly global. And then at that point, maybe we'll start to really understand each other. When the people in the Middle East can start making movies that are cool enough to run in cineplexes in the suburbs of Nashville, then we might start understanding each other, in ways that we can't now.
I'm mindful we're out of time.
Yeah.
You started out talking about nonviolence. Are
Yeah.
you familiar with the work of Dr. Marshall Rosenberg and his book Nonviolent Communication?
Oh, I know the book, because the people in Tassajara, the Zen monastery that I go to often, they reference it a lot. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. How can you communicate carefully?
Studying that enabled me to start understanding better the people who thought differently than me politically.
Yeah.
And understanding that basically it comes down to fear.
Yeah, there was a great... I've come to really like Cracked.com as a website. It's a humor website, but they're incredibly insightful. And there was this article about how conservatives and liberals really want the same thing. And the writer, in a very humorous but very poignant way, pointed out how, if you look at the left and you look at the right in this country right now, they really want the same thing.
We all want the same.
Yeah, and that's important to notice, because it's very easy to characterize the other guy as evil, but when you start to say, well, the other guy also doesn't want fascism to take over America, for example. He just thinks Obama is a fascist, and and these guys think Bush is the fascist. But it turns out probably neither of them is the fascist. They're just it's a complicated. Maybe I should read that book. I know a lot of people who have read it, but I haven't. Okay, good. I think we're at our limit, and I'm certainly at mine because I've been talking almost literally the entire day.